Um, Lauren is an author of two books now, and one is called The Plum Neighbor. She's going to talk about that a little bit. And her newest book, which is just being released this month, is A Place for Harvest, The Story of Kenny Higashi. And you'll hear more about that tonight. It's a beautiful illustrated children's book. Lauren was a teacher and a journalist in the Black Hills, and she is really getting out with book release events right now and getting really busy with school visits. She wants everyone to know she is available to do school visits virtually like this or in her area of the country. So I'm going to introduce Lauren, and if you would like to ask her questions at the end, she will be able to entertain those questions. And the way we're going to do that is you will type them into the chat and I will moderate them, and sometimes I put them together if they make sense that way, and then Lauren will fill them for as long as the time allows. So without further ado, I introduce you to Lauren Harris, and she is going to tell us all about Kenny Higashi and the 100th/442nd Unit in World War II. So thank you, Lauren, so much for joining us. What a pleasure.
Well, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. I'm really excited to share with everybody tonight. I hope just to take you on a little bit of the amazing journey that I've been on, learning more about our country's history, the inspiring and rich history of kindness and determination. Is just really amazing. I thought I'd start with a little bit more of my background. I grew up in a military family, so we traveled quite a lot, and through our travels, we visited many important historical sites throughout the country. I love to read. I read just about every book that I could find, and I gravitated toward books about history. I had been to some of those places, so I was interested in reading more about them, and this combination just really made me very interested in the past actions of people, where these events took place, why people did what they did, and I would think who stood in the same spot where I'm standing right now, and what were they like, and why were they there? And I also love children, so I became an elementary school teacher. And what do you think we spent a lot of time on in class? History, yes. And then when my husband and I homeschooled our own 3 children, we studied history, we read history-based books, and we tried to connect those facts that were on the paper with places that we would visit, and looking at pictures of the real people that actually lived. And so this idea of us knowing about history because people wrote about it made me kind of interested in writing also. I already loved to write as a creative outlet, so it made sense to combine those two. And at the time, we lived in the Black Hills of South Dakota in a little town called Spearfish. And I wrote for several years as a correspondent for the Rapid City Journal and some local other periodicals. And through this experience, I was able to interview many people, ordinary people, doing extraordinary things. And so maybe their actions wouldn't make the history books, but what they did made a big difference to the people around them. And I really loved sharing those stories with readers. And I thought about it that our world is filled with ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and many would never be recorded. And someday, many will not even be remembered. One of the stories that I was remembering that came to my mind at this time, my mother-in-law had told me this incredible tale about her grandparents and uncles that lived in Los Angeles at the turn of the 20th century, and then up to the internment of Japanese Americans. And they had some Japanese American neighbors that they loved. And so there's just an amazing story there, and I wrote it down. I thought, oh, look, this is something I should write down. And the sons of both of those families were soldiers in the Army during World War II. And the climax of the story centered around the two of them in a battle far away from home. And I thought I would be clever and kind of nerdy and research which units maybe these these young men may have belonged to. Well, I easily found my mother-in-law's uncle. So I turned my attention to his Japanese American friend. And I did an internet search for Japanese American soldiers during World War II. And I couldn't believe what I found. Here I loved history so much, and I had no idea about what I was going to find. So at this point, I think I will try to share my screen with you and start showing you some of the things that I found. Let's see if this works. There we go. All right. Hopefully all of you can see that. So like I said, I loved history so much. And I'm sorry, there we go. I was just stunned with what I had found, that the Army actually segregated out a group of first-generation Japanese Americans called Nisei during World War II. And not only this, but this unit, which is called the 100th 442nd Regimental Combat Team, was actually nicknamed the Purple Heart Battalion for their just amazing heroic actions that some say turned the tide of the war in Europe. Their medal counts were just stunning. They suffered some of the highest casualty counts of any unit during the war. And I had just never heard of them, and I wanted to know more. This is a picture of them at basic training with their color guard. Just shows how involved they were. My newspaper experience, though, caused me to really wish that I could interview one of these soldiers. I'm looking at all these pictures, and I'm just realizing that many of this generation were already gone. The guys that were working this mortar, shooting these out over to the other side, some of them were gone, and I didn't know if anyone had ever shared, if they had shared their experience, or if anyone had even written it down. And I wish I could have met one of them face to face. And specifically, I wanted to know about a battle that took place in October 1944, which had to do with my family story. A group of US soldiers got trapped for almost a week in a dark forest in France, and they were finally rescued. Here's a picture of some of them. They were rescued by the 100th 442nd. It's referred to as the Lost Battalion that they rescued. And I looked at pictures like this one, grainy black and white photographs, and I scoured World War II nonfiction books, and I kept thinking, wouldn't it be great to meet someone who had been there, someone who could tell me all about it. And I had just in a casual conversation once, I found myself just stunned again. I told a very non-judgmental friend who wouldn't think I was weird that I wanted to meet one of these veterans, and she said that there was a World War II veteran of Japanese ancestry that lived just a few miles from my house. I couldn't believe it. He was 94 years old, and his name was Kenny Higashi. I just couldn't wait to meet him. I had to know if he was part of this Purple Heart Battalion I had been reading about. So my friend planned a visit with me to the Higashi home, and Kenny Higashi and his wife greeted me. I think they were a little bit amused because here I am, a stranger, and I'm just really eager to ask Kenny about his experiences. There we are. You can see he's holding a medal. He's holding a replica of his Congressional Gold Medal that the unit was given. But he very graciously sat down with me, and we started. I had a list of questions, and it took several years, actually, many interviews that we had after this one. But the first thing I wanted to know is how he came to even live in South Dakota. Because during the early 20th century, a lot of Japanese immigrants came to America, but they made it mostly to the islands of Hawaii, and they settled on the West Coast. But it turns out that Kenny was born and raised in the Black Hills, the sons of Japanese immigrants. So he was a Japanese American Nisei of first generation. So the story is that his father had a lot of farming experience and decided to move away from the West Coast when he came to America. He left the coast and headed inland. He spent some time in Nebraska and then probably following the sugar beet harvest. And then he ended up coming through the Black Hills of South Dakota. And this is what it would have looked like about that time. This is actually where he ended up settling. The Black Hills at this time were a home to a lot of immigrants, but mostly from Northern Europe. And there were some gold seekers as well coming in even as far as South Africa, but there weren't any Japanese American or Japanese immigrants that had come and settled in this area. But that didn't bother him and his brother. They were attracted to this wide open land and all the small agrarian towns. So one of the brothers brought his wife and settled there in the Black Hills. The other brother went back to Japan in 1916, married his childhood sweetheart, and brought her to the Black Hills. And here they are. They started a family and they raised their 2 sons and 3 daughters here in Spearfish in the Black Hills of South Dakota on a small truck farm. And their last name was Higashi. So their second son was Kenneth Ray Higashi. There he is when he was a baby. He was born in 1921, and he grew up just like every other South Dakota boy. He had his 1 older brother and he had 3 younger sisters. His cousins and aunt and uncle lived in the next town over. He had a long chore list every day at home. He loved baseball. He learned to fish and shoot small game, and everyone in town knew this family. They loved them and they respected them, and they even supported them after Mr. Higashi passed away in 1940. The Higashis were a very hardworking family, and they were known for their kindness and helping folks in town anytime they could. Kenny had many friends who would literally be his friends for life. This is a picture of the class of 1941. This was their senior dinner. The theme, I believe, was Under the Sea. So here he is. I think as you can see him circled there. He was surrounded by his friends, and these would literally, like I said, be his friends for life. So he graduated that year from Spearfish High School in 1941. There he is in his yearbook. Looks like he liked baseball, at least. And he was really trying to figure out what to do with his life. He did not have a specific thing he enjoyed. He enjoyed a lot of different things, so he wasn't sure what to do. But on December 7th, 1941, life changed for everyone in the United States. So we remember that day as Pearl Harbor Day. And Americans were just horrified at this act of war. And many Americans, especially on the West Coast, they really sought someone to blame. And some people decided that their Japanese American neighbors were going to be the ones that they were going to hold accountable for this. And not everyone was like that. My mother-in-law's family was not that way at all. And I've heard many other stories, but there was a lot of unrest. So President Roosevelt really realized he was trying to task Americans with global peacekeeping, but he and government officials quickly realized the unrest that was growing in communities on the West Coast, and especially in the media wasn't helping with rumors of international spy activity. And so the government decided to do what is just unthinkable. They would decide that all Japanese Americans would be on the West Coast would be forced to leave their homes and their businesses, and they incarcerated them in camps away from the coast. These camps were set up to detain the tens of thousands of innocent citizens displaced by this order, and there would be no exceptions. This is a picture that was taken by a famous photographer, Dorothea Lange. She took this of a grocery that was owned by actually a gentleman who had been born and raised in that area in Oakland. He even went to the university there, but he was forced to sell his place to move, and he decided to put this sign up in his shop just to make sure everybody knew. At this point, I was wondering if Kenny experienced this kind of aura of suspicion and forced removal in his town. This is a common picture that you'll find of the removal of the Japanese American families. I had heard that any Japanese Americans that lived away from the West Coast would not be required to go to the camps. So I thought certainly the Higashis would be exempt from that. But I asked Kenny about this, and he told me this amazing story I just never could have even imagined. So he said that he told me in great detail how one day he came home from work to his farm. This is a picture of their farm. It was quite successful, as you can see by the size of those cabbages in the field there. But he said that he came home from work one day in February of 1942, and he found two men in uniform at his home. And they confiscated the family's radio. They probably, I guess, some sort of security measure maybe to, in case they were going to be spies and wanted to communicate with Imperial Japan, which is crazy. And then they took their shotgun, which was probably in case, I don't know, they wanted to hurt someone in the community. It sounds ridiculous to me, and then they made a proposition to Kenny and his older brother, Clarence. One brother could stay with their mother and their sisters and run the farm and grow food for the South Dakota families during the war. But one brother would need to enlist in the military. Otherwise, they would send the family to the camps. So they had to make a really quick decision because one of the brothers was going to leave home. So I was really wondering a couple of things. The first thing was, how did the Higashis even receive the opportunity? One of them would to fight for the country when the young men in Hawaii, Washington, and California areas were denied. After Pearl Harbor, we had a huge volunteer, and a lot of people enlisted, a lot of young men enlisted, some women too. And their passion and patriotism was really deep. And this was no different for the children of the Japanese immigrants, the Nisei, that were of Japanese ancestry. They lined right up with everybody else to enlist. But I was really disturbed to discover that, and here's a picture of some of those young men that were part of the Hawaii National Guard and Territorial Guard that enlisted, but I was so disturbed when I discovered they were all turned away for service. They were actually classified as 4C enemy alien because they were basically guilty until proven innocent. And so I don't know how it was that the Higashi sons were offered this opportunity. I'm still not sure 100%, but the second question was, how would the Higashis actually have to go to the camps? Like I said, I'd heard that they wouldn't if they didn't live on the coast. So I looked in the newspapers. I did find some articles that discussed South Dakota lawmakers were given the opportunity to build a detention camp, an incarceration camp for the Japanese Americans in the state of South Dakota. But they turned down the federal government's offer because they felt like the citizens of South Dakota were not in favor. Also, I guess there were some security considerations that might need to be made because of the gold mine that was up in Lead. They had said they had military and non-military activity going on where they felt like that might interfere. So I'm still not sure. But what I do know is I interviewed several local people to ask them their memory of the situation, and they were not related to one another other than they'd grown up in Spearfish, South Dakota. They all told me the same thing. The townspeople, would not allow, and here's a picture of downtown Spearfish. You can see it's a small town, but they said they would not let the Higashis be taken to the camps. The townspeople, would stand in the way and prevent their friends, the Higashis and this beloved family, from being removed. I don't know how I asked them, how are you going to accomplish this? And they didn't know, but they were very clear and confident that they would not let them go. So I think the events that I had just discovered here, it really changes the narrative in our country about this time period. Yeah, this is not in the hot zone so to speak, this particular area. And yes, they were also made up of many first-generation Americans from different nations. But I believe that this attitude of support for the Higashis shows a very common American attitude that hard work and mutual respect produces loyalty and devotion regardless of your background and regardless of your skin color. I asked Kenny over the years I met with him, I asked him several times if he ever felt any different than any of his peers in Spearfish, and he always answered me very confidently, no, he never felt different. The only time he ever thought about, oh, I have a picture of him. Here he is with his older brother, Clarence, and their friend, who is unidentified as far as I know, but I have a suspicion it was their friend Buster Vopat that lived down the street, grew up with them, and they were friends for their whole lives. But the only time Kenny said he ever really thought about being of Japanese ancestry was the time that his father traveled to Japan to visit his own father. And Kenny, after school, just wanted to play baseball with the fellas, but they didn't want to play. They wanted to ask him all these questions, and they pestered him, asking him how long would his father be at sea, and what kind of boat would he take, and what was Japan like, and was he bringing back souvenirs? And Kenny didn't really know, but he didn't really care either. He just wanted to play baseball. Here's a picture of Kenny and Buster as young men. I just think that's so cool. But back to the decision that the family had to make. So one of the brothers was going to have to go. So who was going to go? And Kenny told me that he felt like Clarence was he was a mechanic there in town, and Clarence was just gifted with a natural ability to fix cars that matched his interest in machines. And Kenny decided that Clarence possessed more skills to help their family farm, and that Clarence should stay and that Kenny should go. And the men that were there in uniform, they signed him right there into the Army, and he got on an eastbound train the very next morning. So I asked him, how did this make him feel? I mean, he had never left the Black Hills before in this rural area, and now he was venturing out into the unknown, possibly into some kind of prejudicial environment or a deadly situation. I mean, what was he thinking about? And he said, nothing special. He knew it was the right thing to do. The details would work themselves out, and it was a very practical, kind of common sense approach. So that was kind of the way he was. But back to I had my list of questions, I was wanting to ask him, and I wanted to know about his military career. So I kind of began constructing a timeline of his movements. So he was first sent to Fort Benning, Georgia for basic training, but this assignment didn't last long because in June, the Army moved him to Camp McCoy in Wisconsin. And here he joined a group of all Japanese Americans, which they were fresh volunteers from Hawaii, and they had just been assigned up there, and they had been allowed by the government to finally serve. And they were all very excited about that. And they formed the 100th Battalion, and Kenny was assigned to Rifle Company C, and that's where he would stay for the duration of the war. So these guys that he met up there from Hawaii, they were really strongly determined to prove their loyalty. So they brought that with them. They also brought their island customs and their slang, the Hawaiian slang that they knew, and their music, which he thought was great. All of them had Japanese immigrant parents, just like him, but that's where a lot of the similarities ended. He said he felt a little bit different than they did because, he was a Midwesterner through and through. So I wondered what he may have thought. This is a picture of, this is their first winter there. Most of those guys had no idea about snow, and here, they were really excited about things like snow and beer and casseroles and things like that he grew up with in the Midwest. And they made this, it says, you can read there, Mele Kalikimaka, Merry Christmas, right? And Makahiki Hau, Happy New Year. So over the months there in that that next year up into 1943, that unit completed basic training a few times, which was unusual, but they really put them through it and made sure they were battle ready. But in May 1943, they were joined by around 4,500 more volunteers of Japanese ancestry from Hawaii and the mainland. So the West Coast volunteers that came a lot of them left their families, their dads, their moms, their sisters, brothers, their wives sometimes, and young children behind the barbed wire in the garden camps, those incarceration camps that were spread around the country. So they came with the same determination to prove their loyalty to a country which at that point largely rejected them. So with the arrival of these new troops, the unit was consolidated and renamed the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. So the 100th was organized a little bit differently, and they did remain separate in name throughout, but they were combined together. That's why we call it the 100th 442nd. For the most part, these guys got along. Here they are doing a little bit of gambling, which was a very popular activity among this unit. And most of the time they got along. And it didn't last long anyway, because Kenny and his unit, his 100th group, were shipped out pretty quickly after that to Europe. So I wanted to ask Kenny if he would talk to me about his wartime experience. He really hadn't talked much about this segment of his life before, and actually not many of the veterans really have. Some of them have shared, but a lot of them didn't even want to talk about it. So through the years, I talked to him a lot of times, and I did get a lot of assistance from historians and different archives, and I began to realize that he was part of something that was very special in our American story. His service record on paper is quite unique. He entered duty in Oran, North Africa, and he served in Italy and France. So he was spread out quite a bit. And he took part in several prominent battles that are really praised for demonstrating some of the most brave and valiant victories of the entire World War II conflict. And he earned a lot of medals, some of which he didn't even remember receiving. So that's how many he got. He stopped serving as boots on the ground, so to speak, when he was wounded in combat. And I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit to April 5th, 1945. Here are the troops. Actually, you can see them with General Mark Clark that they just loved. He took the unit on in North Africa when General Eisenhower actually turned them down. He didn't want to have them come in, and Mark Clark took them up, and then he wouldn't let them go. And then everybody wanted them to be part of their unit, but he said no, he was going to keep them. And he really treated them well and made sure that they got the honor that they were due. But this is the area that Kenny was wounded. It is in the Apennine Mountains in Italy, the Alps in Italy, there in northern Italy. And this battle was really unique. It is considered probably what turned the tide of World War II, the Nazis, and they started to lose their control over Europe at this point. So if you look at the picture with the arrows, those two mountains were named for the battle, the attack, Florida and Georgia. And so Kenny's unit was assigned to take Florida, but behind the other mountain, one of the groups of the 442nd positioned themselves behind, and the 100th was in front. And at 5 a.m. on April 5th, they began a two-pronged attack. Now, this particular battle was taking place because the Germans had conscripted 15,000 Italians, basically made them slave labor, and they had dug themselves into these mountains, and they could see the valley on both sides, and they would just annihilate anyone who tried to get in. The Allied forces actually tried to take this mountain range for 5 months before the 100th 442nd came in. And at 5 a.m., they began their attack. They took the mountain in 32 minutes. So they did in 32 minutes what the entire Allied forces could not do in 5 months. And if you read why, it's really amazing how they just used ingenious tactics, and they just were determined. And yes, they really had sustained a horrible loss of life and devastating injuries. So it was during this assault, Kenny took bullets through both of his knees and he went down. He was in the valley in the front there, and he told me all about it. And he said that he knew he couldn't keep up with the attack and he would need treatment, but he didn't want to bother the medics because they were already so overloaded. I said, "What did you do?" He told me he crawled for a little less than a mile back to camp, just made it back. And by the time he healed, the war was over. So for this service, he received the Purple Heart Medal because of what he did. Not all of his memories were on the shocking aspect of war. Some of his recollections were more fitting for his practical hometown farm upbringing. It was all about the food. So he told me a lot about the food. He told me one time in France, this is a picture of some of the unit there in France. He told me one time they came across a farmhouse that was empty, all the occupants except the chickens. So of course they very practically and, you know, just matter of factly chased them all down and ate them. Of course, I'm thinking he didn't dwell on the fact that there was someone who was driven out of their family farm because of the German occupation and basically the threat of death. But for him, it was all about the food. Once in the Alps, he told me that he was in the Alps, they were very hungry for something other than sea rations. If you've read anything about World War II, they hated their sea rations, which was canned pork and beans. It was like canned stew, canned hash, stuff like that. They say it was the worst in the Army. So he actually used his common sense approach to things, and he found an icy stream, and he said that he wiggled his fingers under the bank of the water under the side and caught fish with his fingers. And it was funny, after 72 years, he's telling me this, it happened 72 years before, he could remember that they were trout and that he caught 25 of them in one day. So he was full of stories like that. Also, I was amazed as he was talking to find out all the places that he visited, some of the world attractions. Oh, there's a picture. I forgot about this one. This just shows that they actually were able to take some prisoners of war there, but you can see the scenery, kind of just the setting of this battle. It was just all the different places they went. So you can kind of see it's how beautiful it is, but how terrible it really was that they were there. But some of the things that he saw, he got to visit the catacombs in Rome. He went into some French cathedrals, and he even hitchhiked over to the Leaning Tower of Pisa. He told me a lot of times he climbed to the top. He actually went up there, and he said the steps beneath him were worn down. They were curved and wavy, worn down by all the visitors over the centuries. I asked him kind of about that, and he said he was just really fascinated by the history of it because he'd read about it in books, and he was curious to see them in person. So there we are, alike, at least in that way. Wanted to see it for himself. I had one more major question on my list, though, for him was, I wanted to know, was he part of that rescue of the Lost Battalion back in October 1944? That was the family story that we had that placed the setting of that. And I couldn't believe it, but he said that he was actually there. And he told me all about the conditions of that day. This is a picture from that actual forest in northern France. And he told me about what it was like, how dark it was in the forest, the bombs that the Germans launched, they called them screaming memes, what it was like to dig a foxhole like this in a thick wooded area, and the rain turning to snow and then ice. And then he told me how his company entered that battle. At this point, he was a sergeant, so he would know. He entered that battle with 29 men and came out with 9. So I could really picture it. It was giving a lot of deep meaning to my 2-dimensional vision that I already had from photographs. And I hadn't seen photographs or read any kind of narratives that told stories like he did, how they positioned themselves in foxholes by pairs. So one would sleep for an hour and one would keep watch for an hour, and then they'd switch. And they did this for 3.5 days. And he told me about how the Nazi bullets, that the Nazis were up in the trees and they would see them move and shoot at them. That wasn't the only concern. The particular kind of bombs that the Nazis used, they would just aim for trees, and the tree would shatter and rain splinters and metal shrapnel from the bomb and cracked limbs all down on them, which was just as devastating as any kind of fight they could be in. So, but he actually earned the Bronze Star Medal for his actions that day. I love how it's described on his citation. It says, Sergeant Higashi's dauntless efforts and unwavering courage are traits to emulate. So as I did all of this research, the 100th 442nd record, it stands as one of the most decorated in all of U.S. military history. Just all the things that they did, and not only that, they did it while leaving their families behind barbed wire, far away from their homes. Their motto was "Go for broke," which is a gambling term for betting it all. It was all or nothing. There's Kenny in his uniform. Not sure exactly where that is, but this motto, "Go for broke." Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I had a picture in there. Another picture. So they gave all or nothing. And if you listen to the veterans that did record their memories, they said they believed it was up to them to preserve the opportunity for all Americans to experience full freedom. Put it back on that. They saw the good in the ideal of the American way, and they focused on that rather than the mistakes and the wrong choices that some people made. They really were very just determined that the color of one's skin should never decide the level of freedom and the potential that that person has. So their legacy is one that is just strength, that was just filled with hope. And Kenny was part of that from the beginning, which was amazing that I got to get to know him and ask him about his life. As part of my research, I contacted a veteran in Hawaii. He was a veteran of the Army, but he had an uncle in Kenny's unit. And as far as I know, Kenny is the only 100th 442nd member from South Dakota that we were able to find. So this gentleman could do all that research. But he was looking for living veterans because he volunteers to assist the veterans to apply for the French Medal of Honor, which I just had up. It's basically a knighthood, and the French people are that grateful. So we applied, and Kenny was actually accepted for the French Medal of Honor, which was a wonderful thing. But in 2019, even as his health declined, we arranged a public ceremony in Spearfish, South Dakota, and the French Consulate General traveled from Chicago, and he presented Kenny with the French Medal of Honor for his service to the French people. Now, this was 75 years before, but they were still excited. The U.S. Army actually sent, there is Kenny up on the stage getting his medals. They sent a general to name all the medals and then pin them on him and thank him for his service, which was really wonderful to be part of that. I asked Kenny what he thought about all those medals. He actually told me he was very sure they belonged to someone else and there was a mistake because they couldn't be his. And that simple practical view of his part in preserving freedom is so consistent with what he shared with me many times. He viewed his wartime contribution as just having a job to do and doing it the best he could. He told me that he felt like the real heroes were the ones who didn't make it home. The day of his ceremony, the French Consulate General said, I'm going to quote him here. He said, "A debt that France owes America's greatest generation for their service in World War II is a debt that the French people will never be able to repay in full. The French people will never, ever forget the sacrifice." And, you know, I personally take that seriously, and I think we all could see it as a challenge that we owe a debt that we can never really repay in full. And many of these soldiers are gone, so we don't have the chance to thank them. But if we don't remember them, if we don't honor them and don't retell and recount their personal stories, then who will? So one of the organizations that has taken up this challenge is the Go for Broke National Education Center in Los Angeles. They are set up to preserve the legacy of the all Japanese American soldiers there who served in World War II. And this is the monument that they've put up to remember them. And my family and I visited there in downtown Los Angeles. And if you ever go to that area, I encourage you to go to this monument. It displays all of the names of the soldiers, not just the heroes that didn't make it home, but it has all of the heroes that did make it home. And I actually we found Kenny's name. I underlined it there for you. It's on the black granite there. It's pretty amazing. It was a really wonderful thing. And after meeting with Kenny, he gave me something very special. He gave me the patch from his uniform. And let's see, there's one more picture of the soldiers on one of their marches. There's the patch. It is the arm of Lady Liberty holding up the torch of freedom inside a casket. That was their motto. That was their emblem. So he gave that to me, and I'm very honored to have that. So that is a little bit about Kenny's story and a little bit about what I have learned, which I'm still learning about them. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and I will come back. All right. So I just feel really strongly about preserving the legacy of these soldiers. And I feel like young readers in our country really need to understand what's been done for them, because if they're not aware of the heavy price that's been paid for them and for the freedoms they enjoy, they will easily give them up. And someone will at some point come and take them, and they will have no problems with that. They won't treasure the gift that it is to be American. So I think it's a really important story to tell. I wish I had time to tell you more about some of the things that they did. It was just really amazing. But one of the soldiers, he's Colonel Young Kim is his name. He was an amazing leader. He was actually part of Company B, but Kenny told me several times, and he was very excited and very proud that he actually had seen Colonel Kim in battle. So that's how much they loved Colonel Kim. And he worked on helping to set up the Go for Broke monument back in the 80s. And he said that he felt that the story of the 442nd, the 100th 442nd, was important because he wanted Americans to understand that these individual Americans, the 100th 442nd, made America a stronger country and a better country. So yeah, it's true that they went through a lot of difficulties, but he felt like it was important that everybody know that this was really an American story. And children should understand that it's not just the past, but actually they can learn lessons from those soldiers that will make their life better. So I decided to go ahead and write our family story that I had told you about at the beginning, with the message of the 100th 442nd for children. And I'm very honored that in 2019, the Go for Broke National Education Center chose to print that book. Here is the picture. Here it is. I don't know if you can all see that. So it's available on my website. But I felt like Kenny's story from his hometown to the battlefield and back, because he came back and lived the rest of his life in Spearfish, South Dakota. That was just too remarkable of a story to kind of keep to myself. And I'm just really thankful that South Dakota Historical Society Press felt the same way and published A Place for Harvest, which is our book that we're talking about today. There, see there. And the artist, Felicia Hoshino, who actually had great uncles, I think, in the unit, the 10442nd, she created some beautiful art from pictures. We gave her photographs of the actual places in the book. So Kenny's home and some of the actual places there, and of Kenny and his family. She did a beautiful job. So, and there are photographs as well in the back of the book, and a little bit about the story about the unit. So Kenny did tell me one more thing. He told me his favorite place in the whole world that he visited, and it's in the book. You'll have to look in the book to read it to find out. So